Have you ever witnessed a trial that cost millions, deployed 70 Homeland Security agents, and dominated headlines for months only to crumble in the courtroom because the jury simply didn't buy it and buckle up? Because what happened in the Diddy case today sent shockwaves through the justice system. Prosecutors suffered what can only be described as a monumental collapse, and honestly, calling them losers doesn't even begin to cover it. This wasn't just a legal defeat, it was a full-scale implosion. They tried to paint Diddy as a racketeer, as the mastermind behind an alleged network of trafficking and abuse. But the jury saw through it. They weren't swayed by salacious press conferences or dramatic accusations. Instead, they returned a swift and unanimous not guilty verdict on the main charges. Racketeering, not guilty. Sex trafficking tied to Cassie, not guilty. Sex trafficking tied to Jane, not guilty. These were the charges that justified this entire spectacle, the same charges that brought dozens of agents crashing through doors at Diddy's Miami and Los Angeles homes. And yet after all the drama and the headlines and the speculation, all they got were 2 convictions under the Mann Act, an archaic law that would never have been brought up. If this had stayed within state lines, to understand just how shocking this verdict was, you have to look at how fast it unfolded. Barely an hour into deliberations, the jury was already flagging a problem with one juror. 25 wasn't following instructions, suggesting they were nearly unanimous from the start, and that lone holdout was quickly brought around. This wasn't a hard call for the jury, and it raises a massive question. What were prosecutors thinking from the beginning? Critics have pointed out that this case smelled more like a publicity stunt than a serious legal effort. Remember that bizarre press conference, the one where the U.S. attorney went on about baby oil and like it was an episode of a tabloid talk show, not a federal prosecution? And what did that really have to do with organized crime? Because, let's be real, that was the heart of their case, that Diddy wasn't just a bad guy or a controlling boyfriend, but a racketeer, a criminal kingpin, running some shadowy enterprise. And yet the jury saw something completely different. They saw a messy, toxic, and possibly abusive relationship. They saw bad behavior. Sure, even disturbing behavior, but what they didn't see was proof beyond a reasonable doubt of an organized criminal enterprise, and that distinction matters. Under the law, Bad Boy Records may have been the name on the headlines, about it wasn't the name on any conspiracy charge. Because in the end, this wasn't organized crime. This was disorganized chaos, an emotionally unstable man reportedly doing outrageous things, but not in service of some structured criminal plan, more like personal madness, not mafia. Business burglary, stalking threats maybe. Even assaults, but not racketeering, and certainly not the kind of high-level trafficking. The government-alleged prosecutors were so confident, so loud, they gave interviews, they teased their evidence, they seemed sure they had this one in the bag. But when the jury watched the videos and read the text messages and saw the witnesses in person, they weren't convinced. The so-called freakoff footage may have looked wild, but it didn't prove coercion. The texts from Jane and Cassie, talking about loving the freakoffs, about planning, more of them about being in long-term relationships with Diddy, that muddied the waters too much. And while none of this excuses abuse, and nobody's denying Cassie experienced terrible moments, there is a legal standard for a reason, and this jury didn't see enough to meet it. They weren't swayed by drama or disgust or reputation. They focused on what the law demands, which is exactly what they're supposed to do now. We're left with just 2 Mann Act convictions, and even those raise eyebrows, because let's talk about what that really means. The Mann Act originally created to target racial mixing under the guise of morality. Laws is rarely used today, and when it is, it's often in cases prosecutors can't bring as felonies under modern statutes. Here it was used to say that Diddy paid a sex worker and had her flown to him. That's it, that's the case. Something that, if it happened to all within California, would be considered a misdemeanor at best, likely not even prosecuted at all. But because it crossed state lines, suddenly it's a federal issue, punishable by years in prison, and let's be honest, that feels wildly disproportionate. When you step back and look at the bigger picture, sure, hiring a sex worker is illegal, but is it something? You throw a man in federal prison for a decade over, especially when local authorities probably wouldn't even file charges on it. If it happened down the street from the courthouse, this entire prosecution feels like it was built to fail a spectacle from the start, and it's hard not to wonder if that was the real point. Was the goal justice or headlines? Because the headlines came fast and furious, and now so has the collapse of the case, even with 2 convictions. The government looks weak. They promised a kingpin and delivered a misdemeanor, and we're not done yet because they're still sentencing, and many wonder if Diddy will face significant time given the convictions are under such an outdated statute. The judge may not throw the book at him despite the emotional weight of the allegations, and yes, there's always the argument that you punish a man for being a menace, even if the technical charge is weak. But that's not how justice is supposed to work. We saw what happened when that logic was applied in the O.J. Simpson kidnapping case, where the court clearly punished him for past sins, rather than the actual facts of the case. That was wrong then, and it would be wrong now, whatever you think about Diddy. Whatever you believe about Cassie or Jane or the chaos that seems to follow him. That changes the burden of proof or the standards of fairness. Because this isn't about feelings, it's about facts. And to Today, those facts led to a verdict that stunned the public, embarrassed the prosecution, and completely flipped the narrative from one of accountability to one of collapse. Now, as the dust settles on this dramatic courtroom saga, one thing is clear: the public may be divided, but the law has spoken. And what remains is a question that will haunt this case forever. Was it ever really about justice? Or was it about image power and public perception? When you strip away the noise, the flashing cameras, and the headlines, what you see is a case that fell apart at its core. The prosecution gambled big and lost bigger. And even though they secured 2 technical convictions on the Mann Act, it's impossible to ignore how far they missed the mark from the moment. The raid footage aired with dozens of agents swarming Diddy's homes. The public was primed for a dramatic downfall. But as the trial wore on, the evidence just didn't support the narrative that had been built up. By the time the jury began deliberating, it was already clear that the government's foundation was shaky, and then it crumbled completely. The jury's fast and decisive verdict wasn't just a rejection of the charges, it was a rejection of the entire theory behind the case. The idea that Diddy was a criminal mastermind, orchestrating a network of trafficking and abuse, was dismantled in a matter of hours, and the fallout from that is going to reverberate for a long time. Because this wasn't just about one man, it was about the credibility of the system itself, and about the power of prosecutors to shape public opinion before a jury ever sees a single piece of evidence. And when they fail spectacularly like this, the consequences go beyond embarrassment. They erode public trust, and now people are asking, was the government too eager to make an example out of a celebrity, too hungry for the headlines to see how weak their case really was? And if they knew the case was shaky, did they go forward anyway because they thought the court of public opinion would pressure the jury into a conviction? Well, the jury didn't fold, and neither did the facts. And that should be a wake-up call for everyone who watched this case unfold. Another layer here, a more human one, because at the center of all this are real people, real relationships, and real pain. No matter what the verdict says, Cassie and Jane are not just names on a legal filing. They are women who lived through something. Well, the court didn't find enough proof of coercion or trafficking. That doesn't erase their stories, and that's part of what makes this case so complicated, so emotional, and so explosive. Forced us to look at how messy these situations really are, how consent and power and control can twist and overlap in ways that don't fit neatly into legal boxers. But when it comes to the law, it's about evidence, not emotion. And the evidence simply didn't rise to the level of the charges brought. Now, as Diddy walks away from the courtroom with only 2 convictions under a century-old statute, the question becomes, what happens next? Will he face jail time? Will he be quietly sentenced to probation? Will the public ever see this as vindication or merely a technicality? The outrage online has not died down, and likely won't for some time, because for many this wasn't just a case, this was about finally holding a powerful figure accountable. And when that didn't happen, it felt like a failure, even if it followed the rule of law. And while the prosecution may claim some small victory, the reality is this was a total collapse of their primary arguments. And no amount of spin can change that. They promised fireworks and brought a sparkler. They promised closure and delivered confusion. And what makes it worse is the lingering suspicion that this was never about a winnable case, but about sending a message, and that message backfired. Because now Diddy walks away not as a convicted trafficker or a racketeer, but as someone who beat the system, and for better or worse, that's how many will see it. And that perception will carry weight in the industry, in the media, and in the streets. Because whether or not you believe he's innocent, he wasn't found guilty of the charges that mattered most, and that changes everything. But it also opens the door to something else. A reckoning in how these cases are built, prosecuted, and talked about in the public arena. Because if prosecutors can't deliver what they promise, and instead turn serious allegations into spectacle, then they risk damaging not just their own credibility, but the credibility of every survivor who steps forward. And that's the most painful part of all. If this case was about attention, if it was about headlines instead of justice, then it may have hurt the very cause it claimed to support. And that's a tragedy beyond any verdict. Because justice isn't just about putting someone behind bars. It's about pursuing truth and protecting the vulnerable. And when you miss that mark, especially this badly, the damage can echo far beyond the courtroom. The truth is complex. Diddy may still face lawsuits and public fallout. Cassie and Jane may continue to share their stories, and the public will continue to debate every detail. But the legal outcome is now set, and in the eyes of the law, the case that once seemed like a guaranteed takedown became a high-profile misfire lesson in the limits of narrative-driven prosecution, and a stark reminder that justice has to be built on evidence, not assumptions. So as we close this chapter on HollyLeaks, remember, this is not the end for Diddy or for those accusing him, but it is a turning point, a moment when the system failed to convict despite its best efforts, and maybe, just maybe, a sign that justice cannot be manufactured no matter how loud the headlines get. And if you want more raw, unfiltered truth behind the biggest celebrity trials, scandals, and shockers, be sure to like and subscribe to HollyLeaks for the stories the mainstream won't tell you.